All right, time for another Q&A. So I'm going to try to keep this less than 20 minutes. So starting off with thoughts on colon cleansing. Now that could have a few definitions, but I feel like what you're asking is colonic hydrotherapy, which I love. I think colonic hydrotherapy is extremely beneficial. I remember my first time that I had gone to it. This is many years ago, and it was painful initially because you're getting really pressured up with water, and then everything flushes out, and that just keeps happening repeatedly to clear out the colon, whether it's like plaque or whatever else is built up in there. And afterwards, though, I felt phenomenal. I felt really, really good because a lot of stuff can be in there. So funny story, my colonic hydrotherapist was telling me that she had this woman, and they were doing the colonic, and she passed a Barbie head. It was like really mangled and everything, but she knew, like, the woman knew exactly what it was because she had swallowed a Barbie head. I don't know how, why, whatever, but she swallowed a Barbie head 6 years prior. So that Barbie head stayed in her system for 6 years. And so if you think about it, that Barbie head should not be there. And that means the immune system was creating inflammation the entire time, trying to break this thing down. So hopefully not everyone's swallowing Barbie heads, but we talk about plaque and buildup of fibers and things like that in the colon. So we get this underlying low level of inflammation. And it's really hard to get anything to the colon, like especially orally. This is why we look at a lot of suppositories and stuff like that. Side note though, but the colonic hydrotherapy can clear that out. And then this is where a lot of people will mention a decrease in inflammation. I find that the most common thing is brain fog tends to really improve, like mental clarity and everything. And that's how I felt. Like immediately after the colonic, I felt a lot of mental clarity. And so it can be really good at driving down that low lingering inflammation. And I think like it's pretty standard. You can Google in your area, look at reviews and stuff. I like My Lady because as a male, that was the first time having something shoved up my butt by a different person. And so it took a lot of like making me comfortable. So I really like her. So I don't know, just look up reviews and whatnot. But yes, it is extremely beneficial. But people become obsessed with them, and then they actually end up flushing too much, like i.e. the bacteria. And so they damage, if you will, the microbiome in the colon. And so it's very important to do this, strategically and whatnot. And obviously context is extremely important. There are a lot of people that I probably wouldn't recommend to start off with a colonic. You want to build up to that. Make sure that, like if you're IBD, for example, you might not want to do that right away, especially if you have like hemorrhoids or fissures or a lot of damage down there in the lower region of the colon, stuff like that. But otherwise, it is pretty safe to do a colonic, and I do think they're extremely beneficial. I do think every person should do one, and they're different than enemas. There's more pressure, if you will. Like an enema is like self-controlled, and the water is just not trickling in, if you will. Where a colonic is, there's much more pressure that going in. It's not forced in, like there's not a pump pushing the water in. It's gravity fed, but there's just a lot more pressure compared to an enema. And so that's what makes them different and more effective in that way. Not detoxing, because that's where the caffeine comes in, but in that clearance aspect, a colonic, very beneficial for that. So yeah, I really like colonic hydrotherapy. Creatine for IBD, so irritable bowel disease. Creatine's for everything. I don't know off the top of my head if there's a case out there. I'm sure there's some genetic thing that somebody shouldn't be doing creatine, maybe. But otherwise, every human being on earth could be doing creatine. Should they? That's up for debate, meaning like, are you getting enough from the diet? I don't think so. I think every person should be, but that's just an opinion. And when we look at what creatine does, I mentioned it on, I think it was the last Q&A, of how it really helps with acetylcholine levels. And so that in return really activates your vagus nerve, which then really calms down your stress, activates more of the parasympathetic response, which reduces interleukin 6, because interleukin 6 really pushes Th17, which is associated with IBD. So yeah, creatine can indirectly support IBD by reducing the interleukin 6 potentially. But it's just really great for brain health in general, and sparing nutrients, if you will. So yeah, I think every person should supplement creatine. High quality, of course, creatine monohydrate. I don't think the Creapure is, I don't think you need to go that length. It can be difficult to find Creapure, and it's super expensive. Creatine monohydrate works just great. Thorne has a good one, stuff like that. I recommend just getting just creatine monohydrate though. I think Designs for Health is always very high quality, but they tend to throw a lot of other stuff in their formulas. So I recommend just the only ingredient being creatine monohydrate. Then you can start with 5 grams and work your way up to 20, 30 grams, depending on the person. You just want to work up because it can cause gastric distress. But yeah, creatine for IBD, I think, can be a wonderful tool, and that everyone should be doing creatine. Like I said, unless there's some crazy genetic thing. And once again, if somebody takes creatine and they have that negative response, it's like, well, is it because of the creatine, or are there 300 other variables that need to be considered? But yeah, creatine for IBD, I think, is a pretty good idea. Why do we need so much protein, especially for healing? So, I mean, amino acids are the building blocks, right? And so when we look at it from a nervous system perspective, it's very important to support the nervous system. You need those amino acids from protein in order to build neurotransmitters. So when we look at like stress, very cortisol, catecholamine driven, so adrenaline, norepinephrine, epinephrine, etc. Dopamine is your healthy stress response, meaning the more dopamine you have, the less cortisol or catecholamine, so advanced stress hormones, that you will use. And so I kind of like explain it in the terms of like anger. So people who tend to be angry, or maybe this can be more relatable, is a lot of people are aware of what bipolar is, or they've had experience with bipolar, whether it's with themselves or friends, family, etc. And that is one, I mean, it's a big subject. I'm just trying to make this relatable, but it could be a dopamine issue. So what happens is, I think the most common way we look at bipolarism is anger. So they get angry 1 second and then, or emotional or whatever, and then they're fine the next. And so what that is that outburst of emotions of anger, I'm mainly focusing on anger here, is building dopamine. So it builds dopamine, and then they got their dopamine. So then that's what they were looking for, right? And so then that's where the ups and downs come from. And so when we have optimal levels of dopamine, we are better responding to our stressors because we're going to use that dopamine. And so what happens now with more dopamine is a whole cascade of positive benefits. Well, as long as the dopamine is within control, don't just go taking a bunch of dopamine stuff. Not a good idea. Trust me, I've been there. But when you are using optimal levels of dopamine, you're using less cortisol, so you're less catabolic. Even though, remember, cortisol is important, very important, but it's that chronic cortisol. You are using less cortisol, less catabolic. You are no longer being pro-inflammatory from too much cortisol. You're no longer exhausting nutrients and everything, but the thyroid is also functioning very well. And maybe it was last Q&A, or so at some point I talked about the thyroid, where when cortisol levels are high, thyroid tends to downregulate, we'll say. And so that's why you look at thyroid supplements tend to contain L-tyrosine. Yeah, it plays a role in the gland, but it also is a building block for dopamine. And so the more dopamine you have, the less cortisol you could use. And so it's that it plays a big role in the nervous system. So just building neurotransmitters in general, acetylcholine as well, gamma aminobutyric acid, GABA, and serotonin and stuff. So that's mainly where I focus on it, because a lot of the people, all over the people that I work with, have very strung out nervous systems. And so this is why we want to look at protein. But it's extremely important to understand that protein is the hardest macronutrient to digest. And so if you are having gut issues, you may actually want to tone down on the protein. Now, that's protein, which is all 9 essential amino acids, and let's just say one big conglomerate. You could do essential amino acids where it's just essential amino acids, because the protein is hard to digest. The immune system recognizes protein. So what happens is a lot of people, because their nervous systems are strung out, they don't have enough HCl, they don't have enough pancreatic enzymes, which we'll talk about that in a second because someone asked a question on that. And so what happens now is the immune system has to pick up the slack to digest the protein, which then creates more inflammation. And so when we look at that, some people need to actually do low protein for specific periods of time. It also can create a lot of pressure. So back to the inflammation, when you sprain your ankle, it swells, right? That's inflammation. It's just doing its job. Same thing happens in the GI tract. It begins to swell. And so we can see bloating. Those with irritable bowel disease can see blood, mucus, and things like that. And so that's the context of maybe you want to do low protein, or you improve your capacity to digest protein by stimulating the vagus nerve. Aloe veras, HGLs. Not a big fan of digestive enzymes anymore because they are to break things down, and most people are already dealing with a catabolic response. Most, I should say, actually, I shouldn't say most, sorry. But yeah, you could look at some protease or whatever, serrapeptidase, nattokinase, things like that. But once again, remember, those are designed to break down, and you're probably already wrecking the gut and stuff. So I don't know if that helps at all. It's becoming very contextual, but in regards to your question, why we need it, especially for healing, It's a building block for a lot of things, especially neurotransmitters, really helps the nervous system. And so that's where protein becomes very important. Not to mention like protein sources and then micronutrients that they contain. So we're talking about like a lot of B vitamins, acetylcholine, or choline, and creatine in there, like red meats and everything, and brain fat carnitine and all that kind of stuff, right? So very important for mitochondrial health and just physiology in general. So once again, it's like, is it protein specific or is it like the protein sources? Because like, okay, you could do protein shakes. Yes, they're a little easier on the digestion, but they also contain a bunch of metals and fillers and stuff. And so once again, it gets very contextual. So tangent aside, it's usually the nervous system that protein is very important for when it comes to healing. What are ways to prevent getting sick, both supplements and other stuff? So sunshine, grounding, restoring that redox. Now, with that being said, if you're somebody who hasn't gotten a lot of sunshine or grounding and you start to do that, you could actually become sick. And that's only because you're shifting the charge of the cell, you are stimulating redox, and you're mobilizing toxins, and you're bringing things to the surface so your body can get rid of them. Totally normal process. Nothing bad about that at all. It's just maybe microdose those things. But let's say you have already been doing some of that, you can increase that further to help with the immune system, especially when it comes to redox, so that immune system can function as it should. Like to prevent getting sick, realistically, it's just like adequate micronutrients, controlling stress. Once again, cortisol levels, making sure they're optimal so you're not suppressing the immune system, because chronic cortisol suppresses the immune system. You know, it's like preventing getting sick is just everything as health in a whole, if you will. But you could also look at thymogen alpha 1. Thymogen alpha 1 will help restore the thymus gland. So it can really help with, you know, an suppressed or exhausted immune system, if you will, and help produce natural killer cells. Very important when it comes to fighting literally everything. So thymogen alpha 1 can be a very valuable tool for preventing getting sick. Now, with that being said, it's like if you have a ton of health problems, it's just taking thymogen alpha 1 isn't going to help. Like you have to take care of all the underlying stuff or work on the underlying stuff to make sure that immune system isn't exhausted. But there are a lot of modalities that you could utilize to prevent getting sick. But sunlight and grounding is one of your biggest tools. Red light therapies and stuff like that can go a really long way as well. And positivity, right? Because those negative emotions will be very immunosuppressive. And so positivity, social bonding, making sure you're spending time with friends and family and whatnot, that goes a long way too. Which is funny because a lot of times other people are sick and you spend time with them and you get sick. But anyways, if you feel like you're getting sick, glutamine and zinc is a very basic tool, but can be very powerful. Very high doses of glutamine and zinc. I made a post many years ago on that. We're like 80 to 100 grams of glutamine spread throughout the day, and zinc picolinate up to 350 milligrams spread throughout the day. Do that for 2 or 3 days, and you can usually kick that sickness in most cases. Sometimes glutathione, once again, it's very contextual, but to prevent it, just be healthy, I guess. Like I said, sunshine, grounding, social bonding, things like that. You know, nature, forest bathing. Like look up forest bathing. It's phenomenal what forest bathing can do. The essential oils from the trees and the grounding on the earth and just away from EMFs and everything. So there's a lot of things like that. We're like on my last Q&A, one of the Q&As where it's why is it so hard to heal? Our society is set up for us to get sick, right? So trying to get away from that society can really help prevent you from getting sick. Obviously, we have to be part of this society, but the more time you can spend away from it, the better, even if it's just 1 day a week or every other weekend for that matter, right? So getting out to the mountains, the trees, the beach is the best. I don't know if anybody knows what a Faraday cage is, but it's like, it's supposed to block EMFs. Being at the beach in the water is like a Faraday cage. So tons of benefits there, Have you heard of EviNature? Thoughts? Yeah, a lot of people use EviNature. I believe, I mean, I think they have a ton of products, but I know mainly what people are focusing on is the curcumin and Qing Dai. And so I find it 50-50. Like curcumin's whatever, like a lot of people can have decent responses with curcumin. I don't think it's as great as people make it out to be. Dragon's blood is much better in regards to anti-inflammatory benefits. But once again, too, curcumin, a lot of companies will make turmeric or curcumin with bioperine or whatever, which will inhibit the CYP3A4 enzyme, so it can cause liver issues. It just depends where your CYP enzyme is at. Contextual again. It's the Qing Dai that makes it 50-50. I've had many people do Qing Dai and get way worse. And I'm not entirely sure why. I think it's more of just gut distress is what it is, because Qing Dai, any Chinese herb is usually full of fillers or dextrose. especially in pill form. And so maybe it's that. So I usually recommend, I don't really recommend EviNature, nothing against them or whatever. I just, mainly maybe more on IBD. It's something I'm cautious with. General population could maybe benefit really well from EviNature, the one with the Qing Dai, but I'm not a huge component of it. I would rather use dragon's blood and just not Qing Dai at all, or like higher doses of glutathione and vitamin C for managing that immune response, things like that. So like obviously curcumin antioxidant as well, but once again, dragon's blood. I think dragon's blood is much better than curcumin, and I very, very rarely use curcumin now. But I know a lot of people use that CurcuD, which is from EviNature, which is the curcumin and Qing Dai. Great feedback. I think it's a 50-50 thing. So plus, I think there's more affordable products that work just as well, if not better, than EviNature. Once again, nothing against EviNature, it's just my experience. And last one, how do you fix pancreatic insufficiency? So pancreatic insufficiency is going to be a nervous system problem. It's going to be an immune problem. It's going to be a gallbladder problem. So there's going to be a lot of things at play. It could be a parasitic problem on top of a mold problem. So you have something called the sphincter of Oddi. And so your bile ducts and pancreatic ducts, they meet, and then that's where they get squirted into the small intestine. And a lot of dysfunction can occur with that sphincter of Oddi. More so in females because of estrogen. Like estrogen plays a really big role on causing dysfunction of that sphincter. And this is one of the mechanisms of why a lady around her cycle could be experiencing more symptoms. So thyroid plays a big role in that too. Like T4 plays a big role in that sphincter. So once again, we tend to see a lot of thyroid problems. And if we have estrogen problems, we're going to have thyroid problems because estrogen will increase thyroid binding globulin. So you bound to that thyroid and kind of make it useless. And so a lot of that can impact that sphincter of Oddi. Now this is maybe different when it comes to men. It could be more parasitic related. We tend to see that a lot, or even mold related. But once again, if the gallbladder is struggling, also because of parasites and mold, then that means the pancreas will be struggling. So that's a lot to consider there. But also it's just a lot to do with stress, because when you're stressed, like digestion, I guess one way I could mention it is digestion is not important for immediate survival. And so you just don't produce a lot of pancreatic enzymes, and you're stressed. So your resources are being depleted. Inflammation is high. And so a lot of times when you focus on that vagus nerve, that alone can really help a lot of people with pancreatic insufficiency. And so gargling, I mentioned gargling before, believe it or not, like gargling like 3 to 5 minutes before a meal has tremendous benefits on digestion. Not everybody, right? Like, but there's a lot of people that will start gargling and just mention, hey, like I noticed a big improvement with digestion, because stimulating that vagus nerve activates that parasympathetic, which is that rest and digest. So you produce hydrochloric acid, you produce pancreatic enzymes, you get gallbladder contractions. The big thing too is HCl. Think of it as like a switch. HCl has to reach a certain point to turn on a switch to produce these enzymes to stimulate these gallbladder contractions. And so that's where supplementing HCl could be beneficial. Be careful of H. pylori and ulcers and whatnot, and don't use it as like a long-term thing. You want to restore optimal HCl naturally. That's totally hypocritical of me. I use HCl long-term, but I have a stressful job and such. So I'll take HCl usually, lower doses though. But stimulating that vagus nerve is one of your biggest components for working on that pancreatic insufficiency. And so, like I said, gargling, humming, singing, all those kind of things. There are devices, and I think they work well. There's things like that, but also acetylcholine. Like taking alpha GPC is very beneficial for not only your brain health, your learning and focus. So many benefits to it, but it's also going to help activate that vagus nerve to activate that rest and digest, so you can actually produce sufficient amount of pancreatic enzymes. But as mentioned, it could be parasites, it could be mold, it could be in women higher levels of estrogen, it could be thyroid dysfunction, but in men it's probably more infectious related and stress related, which go hand in hand. So kind of look at those areas, and as mentioned, if you have any more questions on that, just drop in the comment. Hopefully I elaborated enough. But yeah, that's all the questions for this week. Hope you guys enjoyed that, and we'll see you in the next one.